Reactions against apartheid in those days were, first of all, a protest against the celebration of the tercentenary of the arrival of Henri Beck at the Cape. Then the launch of the Defiance campaign in 1952, defiance of apartheid restrictions. In 1955, that very significant event of the Congress held at Kliptown near Johannesburg, bringing together 5 liberation movements: the ANC, the South African Indian Congress, the South African Congress of Trade Unions, the Colored People's Organization, and the Congress of Democrats, which had assembled Marxists and semi-Marxists after the suppression of the Communist Party in 1950. This Congress proclaimed the Freedom Charter. From 1955 on, during the rest of the decade, there were protests and agitation against various laws like Bantu authorities, Bantu education, against low wages, black removals, liquor raids, and imposition of passes on women. The big event after that was the treason trial of 1956. 156 people were arrested and accused of treason. As the trial went on, the number of accused steadily decreased until 30 remained, and all were found not guilty 4 years after the beginning of the trial. During this time, there were also church reactions. The continuation of our declarations and resolutions. We believed much too naively in those days in the power of statements, the power of words to change hearts. And by this time, the Catholic Church had entered the field of statements and declarations. Our first came out in 1947. The Bishops' Conference, founded in 1947, issued its first statement in 1952, and its second in 1957, and many others followed after that. We made this confession in our 1957 declaration, the one when we called apartheid intrinsically evil. The practice of segregation, though officially not recognized in our churches, characterizes nevertheless many of our church societies, our schools, seminaries, convents, hospitals, and the social life of our people. In the light of Christ's teaching, this cannot be tolerated forever. The time has come to pursue more vigorously the change of heart and practice that the law of Christ demands. We are hypocrites if we condemn apartheid in South African society and condone it in our own institutions. Unfortunately, words again did not achieve an immediate result, and the hypocrisy continued. Prior to this, the Bantu Education Act had deeply dismayed the Catholic bishops because we placed great reliance on our church schools. We made efforts to retain them as private schools when the subsidies were cancelled by the government. We held a financial pledge and pay project which raised £725,000 between July 1954 and the end of 1958. Unfortunately, that effort could not be maintained and sort of fizzled out by the 1970s, though some schools carried on to function bravely on a private basis. I'd like to remind you that the total of £725 in 1955 corresponded in purchasing power to 45 million rand in 1996. So it was quite an achievement. At this time, I found myself making more and more addresses on the racial situation and talking more and more on many platforms. In May 1957, I adopted the prophetic mantle and spoke in these terms: "Woe betide our country when the full consequences of its present policies rise up to plague it. When our country finds itself the pariah state of the world, excluded from football federations and Olympic Games, debarred from international conferences for fear of boycotts by other nations, banned from certain harbors and airports, refused diplomatic representation, and suffering from economic disinvestment. The prophecy, as you know, was fulfilled. In the late 1950s, I became a member of the Durban branch of the South African Institute of Race Relations, and looked back on a very interesting and semi-fruitful cooperation, no, rather fruitless cooperation, with Professor Hansi Pollack, a great member of the university and of race relations. We worked to oppose the Cato Manor removals. Intense church cooperation occurred in opposing the Bantu Laws Amendment Act of 1957, threatening to prevent Africans from attending churches in white areas. Can you imagine such a law? Well, the churches got together and really shouted their heads off over that. And we remember sadly Bishop Clayton, who wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, then J.G. Stradum, and suffered a sudden death almost immediately. God rest him, may he be smiling upon us now at this moment. The end of the Congress period came with Sharpeville on the 21st of March 1960. It was prepared by the fact that in 1958, a section of the ANC, resenting what it felt was disproportionate external influence, including Marxist, broke away to form the Pan-Africanist Congress under the leadership of Robert Sobukwe. The two congresses involved in promotion of minimum wages and anti-pass agitation were competing to some extent. And then the tragedy of Sharpeville. 69 killed, 180 injured due to police shooting, followed by countrywide agitation. There were prohibitions, detentions, arrests, the state of emergency in 122 magisterial districts, crisis measures to save the economy, and the banning of the ANC and the Pan-Africanist Congress. So many went underground. There were the beginnings of a sabotage campaign, and I think Mkhonto Wesizwe becoming strong, the arrest of Nelson Mandela and others, the Livonia trial of 1964, and those sentences of life imprisonment. That I consider the end of the Congress movement period. Convenient label to sum up what happened between 1945 and 1960.